The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the rain fell in a steady rhythm, as if the world were weeping for something that had yet to happen. Ethan Cole sat in his favorite armchair, the one by the window, a book in his hands. He hadn't ordered it, but it had arrived at his house that morning, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. The cover was simple, almost austere. The Mirror of Ink, written in silver letters against a black background. Ethan was a solitary man, accustomed to the quiet of his secluded home on the edge of the forest. He had moved there 2 years ago, after the death of his wife Claire. The house was old, with creaky wooden floors and a persistent scent of cedar that never faded. It was a refuge, a place where he could hide from the world and his own memories. He opened the book and began to read. The story began with a man sitting in an armchair, reading a book. The description was so vivid that Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The man had dark, disheveled hair, a scar above his left eyebrow, and hands that trembled as he turned the pages. Ethan glanced at the mirror on the opposite wall and saw his own reflection. Dark hair, scar, trembling hands. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself it was just a coincidence. He kept reading. The man in the story was named Ethan Cole. He lived in an isolated house on the edge of a forest, a house with creaky wooden floors, an antique clock that never kept the right time, and a lingering scent of cedar in the air. Ethan looked around the room. Everything was exactly as the book described. The story continued, and Ethan began to notice that the events narrated coincided with his own life. The Ethan in the book had also lost his wife, Claire, in a car accident. He had also moved to that house in search of peace. But as he read on, the narrative took a darker turn. The Ethan in the book began to notice strange things. Shadows moving in the corners of his vision, whispers echoing when he was alone, the constant feeling of being watched. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He had also experienced these things in the past few days. He had chalked it up to stress, or maybe his imagination playing tricks on him. But now, he read the next passage, and his heart nearly stopped. Ethan didn't know it yet, but he was being hunted. A killer was watching him, studying his movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. According to the book, the killer would make his move in 3 days. Ethan threw the book to the floor as if it had burned him. His hands were shaking, and his breath came in short gasps. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of prank, a cruel joke. But who would go to such lengths? And how did they know so much about him? He picked up the book again, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. The story continued to describe his life with unnerving accuracy. It mentioned the nightmares he'd been having, the times he'd woken up in a cold sweat, convinced someone was in the room with him. It even described the dream he'd had the night before, a figure standing at the foot of his bed, its face obscured by shadows, a knife glinting in its hand. Ethan slammed the book shut and set it on the table. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what was going on. But the more he tried to rationalize it, the more his fear grew. What if the book was telling the truth? What if there really was a killer coming for him? The next day, Ethan tried to distract himself. He went for a walk in the woods, the crisp autumn air clearing his mind. But even there, he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him jump. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following him. When he returned home, the book was still on the table where he'd left it. He couldn't bring himself to touch it. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the fire, trying to calm his nerves. But the words from the book kept echoing in his mind. A killer is looming. That night, he barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made him sit bolt upright in bed, his heart racing. He kept the lights on, but the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that made his skin crawl. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps outside his window. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bed and crept to the window, but there was no one there. The next morning, Ethan woke up exhausted. He couldn't keep living like this. He needed answers. He picked up the book again, flipping to the page where he'd left off. The story described his walk in the woods, his paranoia, his sleepless night. It even mentioned the baseball bat by his bed. Ethan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the book. He turned the page, and his blood turned to ice. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the killer was closer than he thought. In fact, the killer was already inside the house. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes darting around the room. The house was silent, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. He stood up, his heart pounding, and grabbed the baseball bat. He checked every room, every closet, every corner. But there was no one there. He returned to the living room, his nerves frayed. The book was still on the table, open to the same page. He stared at it, his mind racing. What if the book wasn't just predicting his life? What if it was controlling it? What if it was somehow writing his fate? That night, Ethan couldn't bring himself to sleep. He sat in the armchair, the baseball bat across his lap, and stared at the book. The clock ticked away the hours, each second stretching into an eternity. He kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at him. At around 3 a.m., he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging against wood. It was coming from the front door. Ethan's grip tightened on the bat. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling, and crept toward the door. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. He reached the door and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty. The scratching stopped. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned away from the door, and that's when he saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, its face obscured by shadows. In its hand was a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Ethan's heart stopped. The figure took a step forward, and Ethan stumbled back, raising the bat. But the figure was faster. It lunged at him, the knife slicing through the air. Ethan swung the bat, but it passed right through the figure, as though it were made of smoke. The knife plunged into his chest, and he fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The figure leaned over him, its face still hidden in shadow. As Ethan's vision faded, he heard a voice cold and mocking. The story always ends the same way. The next morning, the house was silent. The book lay on the table, open to the final page. The last sentence read, "And so, Ethan Cole's story came to an end, but the killer's story was just beginning." Outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping against the window pane like 1,000 tiny fingers. And somewhere in the shadows, a figure watched and waited, its knife gleaming in the dim light. The mirror of ink,